Ice does not look dangerous. It forms quietly, without sound, and it changes the way an airplane flies long before the crew can see it. A thin layer on the wing, a frozen sensor, or crystals inside a fuel line is sometimes all it takes to turn a normal flight into an emergency. Today, we look at real flights affected by winter weather and hidden ice. Each one teaches a clear lesson about why pilots and engineers are so wary of icing. If you want more calm, factual aviation stories like this, I hope you will subscribe, like, and share. Your support truly helps. On the morning of December 27, 1991, Scandinavian Airlines Flight 751 taxied out at Stockholm Arlanda for a short hop to Copenhagen, the first leg of a routine service to Warsaw. The airplane was a McDonnell Douglas MD-81 named Dana Viking. On board were 123 passengers and 6 crew members. It was winter in Sweden. Snow covered the fields around the airport. On the surface, nothing about this takeoff looked unusual. The MD-81 had arrived from Zurich the previous evening and spent the night parked outside in temperatures around freezing. Several tons of very cold fuel remained in the wing tanks. That fuel kept the inner wing structure chilled, and during the night, a thin layer of clear ice formed on the upper wing roots near the fuselage. This ice was difficult to see. It did not look like the white frost most people associate with icing. It blended into the wet metallic surface. Before departure, ground crews sprayed about 850 liters of de-icing fluid over the wings and tail. The treatment removed visible snow and slush, but no one performed a required tactile check on the upper wing surface afterward. Company guidance at the time specifically told captains that a physical, hands-on inspection of the wing roots was necessary because clear ice could be missed in a visual check from the ground. That check did not happen. The ice remained in place, invisible but intact. At 8:47 local time, Flight 751 accelerated down runway 08. In the cockpit, Danish Captain Stefan Rasmussen and Swedish First Officer Ulf Tidermark saw normal indications. The takeoff roll was smooth. At the correct speed, the first officer called rotate, and the captain pulled back. The MD-81 lifted off and began climbing toward a low cloud ceiling. For a few seconds, it was a normal departure. As the weight came off the landing gear, the wings flexed upward. That flexing shattered the thin ice on the inner sections. Blocks of clear ice slid backwards along the wet upper surface, then dropped into the slipstream straight toward the 2 rear-mounted engines. Inside each engine, fan blades spun at high speed, pulling in air for compression and combustion. The ice hit those blades with heavy impacts, deforming several of them in both engines. The damage disrupted the smooth airflow that the compressors needed to operate. About 25 seconds after liftoff, the right engine began to surge. Passengers and crew heard a low rumble followed by sharp bangs. In the cockpit, indicators for that engine fluctuated. The first officer correctly identified a compressor stall. The captain responded by pulling the right thrust lever back slightly, trying to stabilize the engine. That reaction was logical but incomplete. The proper procedure was to pull the lever all the way to flight idle. He had never practiced that maneuver in training, and there was no time to search the manual. There was a second problem. Hidden inside the MD-81 systems was a software function that the airline had never briefed to its pilots. Automatic Thrust Restoration, or ATR. When it sensed that one engine was producing less thrust than the other after takeoff, it quietly pushed both thrust levers forward toward go-around power. The crew knew about an older system designed for a similar purpose, but not about this newer one. They did not realize that while the captain was trying to reduce power on the surging right engine, ATR was adding power back on both engines at the same time. With thrust still high, the surges continued. The right engine suffered repeated violent pressure spikes as air flowed backward through the compressors. After several surges, its internal components failed. Metal fragments exited the engine and fell into the forest below. About 40 seconds after the first surges on the right side, the left engine, which had also ingested ice but had remained stable at first, began to surge as well. A TR had driven its thrust up to go-around power, raising internal pressures enough to push it over the limit. Within a few seconds, the left engine also broke apart. 76 and 78 seconds after takeoff, both engines failed completely. The generators went offline, flight deck displays went dark, and the airplane stopped climbing at about 3,300 feet. The MD-81 had turned into a glider over snow-covered forest north of Stockholm. In the cabin, some passengers saw flames or smoke from the engines. In the cockpit, the captain ordered an engine relight attempt and requested an immediate return to Arlanda. Without thrust and with only standby instruments, options were limited. Among the passengers was another SAS captain, Per Holmberg, traveling in uniform. Realizing that the situation was critical, he went forward and entered the cockpit. There he started the auxiliary power unit to restore electrical power and helped manage checklists and configuration. While Rasmussen concentrated on flying, Holmberg repeatedly told him to look straight ahead and keep the wings level. Together, the three pilots worked as a team, one flying, one communicating with air traffic control and running checklists, one managing configuration and monitoring attitude and speed. As the powerless jet descended back into the clouds, air traffic control suggested altitudes and headings, but the crew knew they were too low to reach the airport. They needed a field. When they broke out below the clouds at a few hundred feet, they saw dense forest, scattered houses, and a few open areas covered in snow. Rasmussen first picked a larger field farther away, then quickly shifted to a smaller one almost straight ahead after Holmberg pointed out houses near the original choice and urged a slight turn to the right. While they lined up with the field, they extended flaps step by step to allow lower speed flight without stalling, following the dual engine failure guidance as closely as the situation allowed. As the ground proximity warnings sounded, too low, gear, and pull up, they dropped the landing gear as well. In the cabin, the flight attendants shouted clear instructions for passengers to brace. Many passengers adopted the correct brace position just before impact. Seconds later, the MD-81 hit the tops of trees before reaching the field. Trees tore away much of the right wing and damaged the fuselage. The aircraft then struck the frozen ground tail first and slid across the snowy field for more than 100 meters. As it decelerated, the fuselage broke into 3 major sections, but it remained upright. Overhead bins fell, interior panels broke, and seats shifted. Yet the basic structure in most of the cabin stayed intact. Fuel spilled into the snow, but no major post-crash fire developed. All 129 people on board survived. Around 90 were injured to varying degrees, including several with serious trauma, but there were no fatalities. Passengers evacuated through doors and through the breaks in the fuselage into the cold field. Local residents and emergency services arrived and began treating and transporting the injured. The accident quickly became known in Sweden as the miracle at Gottröra. Investigators later confirmed that the root cause was clear ice on the upper wing roots, formed during the overnight parking and not fully removed by de-icing. When that ice broke off and entered both engines, it produced severe compressor damage and surging. The dual engine failure became inevitable when ATR continued to command high thrust, instead of allowing the crew's power reduction to take full effect. The investigation also found that the airline already possessed detailed information from the manufacturer about the clear ice risk on this wing design, and had even issued a winterization bulletin reminding pilots to perform tactile wing checks, but that this knowledge had not translated into consistent practice. The report led to several important changes. Training on engine surges and compressor stalls was strengthened, with emphasis on immediate power reduction as a memorized action rather than a checklist-driven response. Operators of MD-80 series aircraft were required to understand and brief automatic thrust restoration and similar systems, and to ensure that undocumented modes would not interfere with emergency procedures. Winter operations guidance was tightened to require physical inspection for clear ice when conditions allow its formation, and the responsibility of the pilot in command for that inspection was reinforced. For pilots, Scandinavian Airlines Flight 751 is now a central case in handling sudden dual engine loss after takeoff and in managing hidden automation. It shows how a thin, nearly invisible layer of ice and an unbriefed automatic system can combine into a complete loss of thrust in less than 2 minutes. It also shows how calm cockpit coordination, strict focus on basic flying, and a disciplined forced landing can turn a situation with almost no margin into a survivable outcome in a snowy field. British Airways Flight 38 was nearing the end of a long flight from Beijing to London on January 17, 2008. The aircraft, a Boeing 777-200, descended toward Heathrow after more than 10 hours in the air. Everything on board felt routine. The crew briefed a standard ILS approach to runway 27 left. Passengers gathered their belongings. Nothing hinted that the airplane was minutes away from losing almost all engine thrust at the worst possible moment. The 777 carried Rolls-Royce Trent 800 engines, and like many long-haul jets, it used extremely cold fuel at cruise altitude over Siberia. The fuel had dropped to very low temperatures, still within limits, but cold enough to allow tiny ice crystals to form. This is normal on long flights. Under ordinary circumstances, the crystals melt as fuel warms during descent. But on this flight, something subtle and dangerous happened inside the fuel system. Both engines were fitted with fuel oil heat exchangers, fine-channeled metal units that warm fuel using hot engine oil. Investigators later discovered that in rare conditions, soft ice crystals in the fuel can accumulate on the downstream face of these heat exchangers. When flow suddenly increases, such as during final approach, the crystals can break loose, lodge deeper inside, and momentarily restrict fuel flow to the engines. As Flight 38 approached Heathrow, the crew selected flap settings, reduced speed, and began the last stage of descent. At about 700 feet, the autothrottle commanded increased thrust to maintain approach speed. The right engine did not respond. A second later, the left engine also failed to spool up. To the crew, the cockpit suddenly felt unnervingly quiet. Both engines were still running, but producing only idle thrust. The commander pushed the throttles fully forward, no change. Warnings filled the cockpit. Airspeed began to fall. The jet sank below the glide path. For a moment, both pilots thought it might be a brief surge or lag, but it became clear that they had lost nearly all usable power. Beneath them were houses, roads, and Heathrow's perimeter fence. No time remained for troubleshooting. They needed to fly the glider now. The captain lowered the nose slightly to preserve airspeed, trading altitude for control. The first officer selected flap 25 and called out rapidly changing speeds. The jet floated in near silence toward a grass field just short of the runway threshold. At the last second, the captain pulled back gently, aligning with the only available patch of open ground. The 777 hit the grass hard, left main gear collapsing and punching up into the wing. The nose gear sheared off. The airplane skidded across the field, sliding diagonally until it came to rest just inside the airport boundary. Despite heavy structural damage, the fuselage curled to a stop intact. Fuel lines ruptured, but no major fire ignited. All 136 people survived. Only a handful were seriously injured. The investigation revealed that neither engine contained mechanical faults. Instead, investigators traced the power loss to ice crystals accumulating inside both fuel oil heat exchangers during cruise. When the autothrottle demanded a sudden increase in flow on approach, the released crystals clogged the exchanger cores, restricting fuel pressure to both engines at the same time. This scenario had never been seen on the Trent 800 before. Certification tests had not anticipated this rare icing combination. Rolls-Royce redesigned the heat exchanger with wider channels and better flow characteristics. Boeing updated procedures, and airlines around the world revised their fuel temperature monitoring requirements. The event became one of the most important case studies showing that icing hazards do not only live on wings or control surfaces, they can hide deep inside a fuel system, waiting to appear when power is needed most. British Airways Flight 38 remains a unique accident. A modern wide-body jet quietly losing thrust on short final, gliding over London rooftops, and landing with remarkable precision on a narrow strip of grass. It is remembered not only for the discovery it forced on the industry, but for the calm professionalism in the cockpit, proof that even when every source of power disappears, skilled hands can still bring a heavy jet safely to the ground. The passengers on American Eagle Flight 4184 thought they were on an ordinary short hop between Indianapolis and Chicago on a chilly Halloween afternoon. It was a routine regional flight on an ATR 72 operated for American Eagle, the kind of commuter trip people took without a second thought. Outside, though, the weather over northern Indiana was turning into the perfect trap for an airplane with the wrong kind of ice on its wings. The flight left Indianapolis and climbed toward Chicago O'Hare, but air traffic control was struggling with congestion and poor weather around the busy hub. Instead of turning straight in to land, the crew were told to enter a holding pattern over the countryside near the small town of Roselawn. They would circle there and wait for their turn. holding is a normal part of airline flying. The crew leveled off, set the autopilot, and began tracing an oval in the cold, wet air, time after time. The atmosphere around them did not look extreme. They were in the clouds, in light rain and cold air that was just below freezing. To the human eye, it was simply unpleasant autumn weather. To the ATR's wings, it was something much more dangerous. The airplane had flown into so-called supercooled drizzle drops, tiny water droplets that stay liquid below freezing and then freeze on contact with the airframe. These droplets can run back over the top of the wing before freezing, creating a ridge of rough ice farther aft than usual, behind the de-icing boots that are supposed to keep the leading edge clear. Like many turboprops of its generation, the ATR-72 used inflatable rubber boots on the leading edges of the wings and tail. When ice builds up, the boots inflate and crack the ice off. The system was tested mainly for the kind of icing that sticks right at the front. What Flight of 4184 encountered was different. The supercooled drizzle built a band of ice farther back on the wing where there were no boots. That subtle difference changed the way air flowed over the wing, and how the ailerons behaved when they were deflected. The airplane could still fly. It could still respond to the autopilot. But deep in the aerodynamics, it was moving toward a cliff. For a while, the flight seemed uneventful. The crew commented on the icing, cycled the de-icing boots, and continued in the hold as instructed. The cockpit voice recorder later revealed a familiar mix of routine chatter, checklists, and small frustrations about delays. This was not a crew ignoring the weather. They were aware they were in icing conditions and were using the systems available to them. What they did not know was that the type of ice building on their wings was beyond what the certification tests had truly captured. Eventually, air traffic control cleared the flight to descend slightly and re-enter a modified hold. The airplane changed configuration, with flaps set for the new speed and altitude. Those changes nudged the aerodynamics of the wing yet again. In the background, the flight data would later show a gradual increase in the force on the right aileron as the ice ridge altered the airflow. On the flight deck, there was no obvious warning. The instruments looked normal. There was no stall warning. No alarm sounded that could tell the pilots that the balance of the airplane was now extremely fragile. Then, in a matter of seconds, everything changed. With the airplane still in cloud, the ATR suddenly rolled sharply to the right. The motion was so abrupt that it disconnected the autopilot. The crew were thrown into a violent upset with almost no visual reference outside. They tried to counter the roll with opposite aileron and rudder, but the ice had already shifted the hinge forces in such a way that the right aileron tended to deflect in the wrong direction. Instead of helping, some of the normal control inputs actually worsened the roll. The ATR dropped into a steep, spiraling descent. Investigators later described what happened in simple but chilling terms. The ice pattern on the wings caused a phenomenon known as aileron hinge moment reversal. In plain language, the wing was now pushing the aileron in the opposite direction from what the controls commanded under certain conditions. When the autopilot was holding the wings level in icing, it masked the small, early signs of this change. When the autopilot clicked off, all that stored up imbalance was suddenly handed back to the human pilots. By the time they reacted, the airplane was already rolling past the point where normal corrections could recover it. The ATR plunged out of the clouds over flat Indiana farmland and crashed into a field near Roselawn, breaking apart on impact. All 68 people on board lost their lives. Witnesses on the ground later spoke of hearing the sound of engines and then a sudden impact, but there was no long trail of debris, no extended attempt at a forced landing. The loss of control had been rapid and catastrophic. For families waiting in Chicago that Halloween evening, the first sign that anything was wrong was news that the flight had simply not arrived. The investigation that followed did not stop at the weather. It dug into how the ATR's wing behaved in mixed icing, how the certification tests had been designed, and how much was really known about supercooled drizzle at the time. It found that the type of icing the airplane encountered was within the broad envelope called out in the rules, but the specific combination of droplet size, temperature, and hold time had not been fully appreciated. The accident showed that an aircraft could be technically within its certified envelope while still facing a very high risk of sudden loss of control. Regulators and manufacturers responded with a series of changes. Procedures for using de-icing boots were revised. Crews were told to activate the boots earlier and not to wait for a certain thickness of ice to build up. The icing certification rules were strengthened to better account for supercooled drizzle and mixed icing conditions. A TR modified its aircraft and operating guidance. Airlines adjusted their policies about holding in known icing, especially in the speed ranges and configurations that had proved so dangerous here. For pilots and engineers, American Eagle Flight 4184 became a case that is still studied today. It is not as widely known to the general public as some other disasters, yet its lessons are written into modern procedures. It shows how something as thin as a ridge of ice can overturn the assumptions built into a design, how an autopilot can hide the first warning signs of a changing flight condition, and how a flight that appears completely normal on the instruments can be only seconds away from a loss of control. For passengers, the story is harder to hear, but the outcome of this accident did lead to safer airplanes and safer winter operations. Every time a crew exits a holding pattern early because of icing concerns, every time de-icing boots are used sooner, and every time an airline changes its route planning to avoid extended holds in known icing, there's a faint echo of this flight over Indiana. A short regional trip on a cold autumn day exposed a gap in our understanding of icing and helped close it for the future. On a March afternoon in northern Ontario, Air Ontario Flight 1363 sat on the snowy ramp at Dryden Regional Airport, preparing for a short hop to Winnipeg. It was a routine Fokker 28 service, a flight that crews performed countless times through long Canadian winters, passengers boarded with heavy coats and damp boots, brushing snow from their shoulders as they found their seats. Outside, the snowfall was steady but not severe, the sort of weather that locals considered a normal part of life. Inside the cockpit, though, conditions were setting up a chain of decisions that would turn a simple departure into a tragedy studied for decades. The Fokker 28 was powered by two Rolls-Royce Spey engines mounted at the rear of the fuselage. In this particular aircraft, the Auxiliary Power Unit, the APU, had been inoperative for some time. With no APU, the flight could not run its own systems on the ground without at least one engine running. This meant that the aircraft could not undergo a proper ground de-icing treatment with both engines off, as standard procedures required. It was one of those technical limitations that crews learned to work around, but on this day, it forced the pilots into a narrow corner. Before departure, the captain and first officer reviewed the situation. Snow was falling steadily, accumulating on the wings and fuselage. The aircraft needed de-icing, but shutting down both engines to allow ground crews to apply fluid would leave them unable to restart without external equipment, which Dryden did not have. The alternative was to keep one engine running and perform only partial de-icing, removing the worst of the contamination, but leaving the upper wing surfaces exposed to ongoing snowfall. The captain faced a difficult mixture of operational challenges, time pressure, and fuel constraints. The aircraft was already tight on fuel, and regulations at the time allowed them to continue as long as they remained within dispatch minimums. The passengers settled in as the crew opted for a limited de-icing procedure. The wings were treated as best as possible, but snow continued to fall even as the airplane began taxiing. The ground crew knew the situation was less than ideal. The pilots knew it too. But in a remote airport with limited resources, there was a sense that this was simply how winter flying worked. The captain had flown in far worse weather and believed they could complete the short flight safely. Holdover time, the interval during which de-icing fluid remains effective, was short in these conditions, much shorter than many crews appreciated at the time. Thick, wet snow falling on cold wings was a recipe for rapid contamination. As the aircraft taxied across the small airfield, more snow settled on the Fokker's swept wings, forming a thin but highly disruptive layer. To passengers looking out, it may have appeared trivial. To the aerodynamics of the aircraft, it was enough to fundamentally alter lift, stall characteristics, and handling at rotation. As Flight 1363 lined up on the runway, the crew prepared for a standard takeoff. There was no panic, no sense of crisis, only the steady routine of winter operations. The captain advanced the throttles, and the aircraft began accelerating over the snow-covered pavement. Inside the cockpit, speeds came alive on the instruments. Outside, flakes swept across the windscreen, but beneath the wings, the airflow was unraveling. The contamination, invisible from the flight deck, was already destroying the smooth layer of air the wing needed to generate lift. The Fokker accelerated through the rotation speed, and the captain eased back on the yoke. The nose lifted, but almost immediately the aircraft's climb faltered. The left wing, more heavily contaminated than the right, lost lift first. Within seconds of liftoff, the aircraft rolled sharply left, its wingtips striking the trees just beyond the runway. The impact tore into the fuselage, and the jet crashed into the forested terrain, breaking apart and erupting in fire. Many passengers and crew members did not survive the violent crash, though several managed to escape the burning wreckage in the moments afterward. People on the ground recalled hearing the engine spool up for takeoff, and then, only seconds later, the unmistakable thud of an aircraft hitting the trees. The rescue effort began quickly, but the devastation was immediate and severe. The investigation that followed reached far beyond the snowy runway at Dryden. It examined winter operations across Canada, the limitations of the Fokker 28's design, and the systemic pressures that shaped the crew's decisions. It revealed a patchwork of policies across airlines and airports, many of which left frontline crews to improvise solutions to problems that should have been addressed at higher levels. At Dryden, the lack of ground support equipment, restrictive procedures, and the inoperative APU all contributed to a situation in which proper de-icing simply could not be done. Crucially, the accident highlighted how easily a thin layer of snow, mere millimeters, could destroy the aerodynamic integrity of a wing. At the time, many pilots believed that light contamination could be tolerated, especially on short flights. Air Ontario Flight 1363 proved that assumption fatally wrong. The concept of clean wing operations, now a core principle of winter flying worldwide, was strengthened and formalized in the wake of Dryden. Regulators responded with sweeping changes. Requirements for de-icing equipment were tightened. Standard operating procedures were rewritten to emphasize that no amount of contamination is acceptable on any critical surface, under any circumstances. Airports were required to ensure proper support services. Aircraft with inoperative critical equipment, such as an APU, faced stricter limitations on operating in severe weather. For pilots, the Dryden accident became a defining case study in how operational pressure, equipment limitations, and winter weather can converge into a deadly trap. It is now taught not only as a lesson in de-icing procedures, but as a vivid example of how subtle, systemic issues can shape a crew's choices long before an aircraft reaches the runway. For passengers, the tragedy underscored something often unseen: the complexity behind every winter takeoff. The checks, the equipment, the fluids, the holdover times, each one matters, and each one has been refined through hard lessons like these. Air Ontario Flight 1363 was a short flight that never had the chance to leave the immediate surroundings of Dryden Airport. Yet its legacy reshaped winter flight safety across the world. Modern crews today, standing in snowfall and preparing to depart, operate with procedures built directly on the lessons from Dryden. Every time a pilot delays a takeoff because fluid effectiveness is uncertain, every time an aircraft is fully de-iced even for a brief taxi, and every time dispatch chooses to wait instead of push forward under pressure, the memory of Flight 1363 quietly lives on. The accident showed, in the starkest possible terms, that winter is unforgiving, and that even the shortest flight demands a perfectly clean wing. USAir Flight 405 was scheduled to leave New York's LaGuardia Airport for Cleveland on a snowy night in March 1992. The airplane, a Fokker F-28, had already been delayed, and winter weather around the airport was getting worse. Before departure, the jet was de-iced twice with heated Type 1 fluid, clearing the wings but providing only a short window of protection. That window would quietly close long before the airplane reached the runway. After the second de-icing, the airplane spent more than 30 minutes taxiing in below freezing temperatures, moving slowly in a long line of departures. Type 1 fluid can remove ice but does not prevent it from reforming during long waits. Thin, almost invisible roughness began to accumulate on the Fokker's slatless wings, a type of contamination capable of sharply reducing lift, even when it appears harmless in cockpit visual checks. The first officer inspected the wing several times and believed it looked clear. Nearby crews saw the same. A normal winter scene with no obvious buildup. When the jet finally reached runway 13, the crew set flaps to 18 degrees and began the takeoff roll. Speeds appeared normal, and the first officer called VR. The captain raised the nose, but almost immediately the airplane failed to climb. The left wing began to drop, stall warnings activated, and the jet rolled from side to side while barely above the ground. In less than 10 seconds, it struck runway lights, slid across the end of the pavement, and broke apart as it plunged into the shallow waters of Flushing Bay. 27 of the 51 people on board died, many unable to escape the partially submerged wreckage. Investigators found no mechanical faults. Engines, configuration, and performance calculations were all normal. The cause was wing contamination, a thin layer of ice that reformed during the long taxi after de-icing, reducing lift enough to prevent the airplane from climbing. At LaGuardia, only Type 1 fluid was allowed for jets, and holdover time guidance was limited. No policy required physical inspection or a return for additional de-icing when delays stretched far beyond the fluid's protection window. The accident led to major changes. Airlines adopted strict holdover timetables, stronger requirements for reapplication of de-icing fluid, and more reliable anti-icing procedures closer to the runway. Airports revised rules to allow thicker, longer-lasting fluids when needed. Training emphasized that even a millimeter of ice can destroy the safety margin of sensitive wing designs. USAir Flight 405 and the Air Ontario crash 3 years earlier became a paired lesson. A clean wing is not optional. A jet has only a few critical seconds during takeoff to perform perfectly, and modern winter procedures exist to ensure those seconds are never compromised again. On the 18th of May 2011, Seoul Líneas Aéreas, Flight 5428, left Neuquén on the last leg of a long day of regional flying across Argentina. The aircraft was a Saab 340 twin turboprop, heading south at night toward Comodoro Rivadavia over the empty desert of Patagonia. 19 passengers, 1 flight attendant, and 2 pilots were on board. The weather forecast mentioned only light icing above 8,000 feet. Nothing in the paperwork suggested that this short sector would become the deadliest accident involving a Saab 340. The crew were familiar with the region. Captain Juan Raffo, 45, had nearly 7,000 flight hours, more than 2,000 on the Saab. First Officer Adriano Bellotti, 37, was new to the airline and to the type, with only a few hundred hours on the Saab. He was still learning the airplane but was talkative and confident. Both men knew that weight and weather mattered on this route. At Seoul, flights sometimes left close to their limits, and the captain had previously experienced serious icing over Patagonia. That earlier event had left a mark on his thinking about how to handle ice. By about 1752 local time, the cockpit voice recorder captured the Saab already in climb, toward flight level 190, 19,000 feet. The pilots were discussing company issues, working conditions, and how little management seemed to understand flying in this zone with these planes. In the background, the airplane's climb performance was already marginal. The autopilot was in vertical speed mode, trying to maintain a small positive rate of climb. Engine power was not set to a strong climb setting, and the anti-ice systems, once switched on, drew additional power. As they passed through 17,000 feet, the first signs of ice appeared. The first officer looked at the wing and said he saw only a little line of ice. The captain agreed. They joked that ice made you nervous, then went back to talking about the airline. The airplane leveled off around 17,800 feet. Unable to reach the planned 19,000 with the existing power setting, airspeed began to decay to around 136 knots. According to the Saab's procedures, in icing, they should have been flying at least 160 knots during climb and cruise, achieved by using the autopilot's speed mode and more power. That mode was never selected. Captain Raffo then suggested a descent. In his previous icing encounter, descending into warmer air had helped. He assumed the same logic would apply again. But there was a complication. South of Neuquén, radio coverage was poor. The crew could not raise the regional control center directly. After some difficulty, the first officer contacted a more distant control center near Buenos Aires and had them relay a request for lower altitude. At about 1811, Flight 5428 began descending toward 14,000 feet, where the captain expected less ice, not more. In reality, this layer contained severe icing, with supercooled droplets large enough to overwhelm the Saab's de-icing boots. Almost as soon as the descent began, the ice accumulation accelerated. The captain commented that it felt like ice was hitting everywhere. The first officer said a little ice was forming, then that it didn't shed well. Looking back, he described irregular masses on the wings, using the word bodak for the lumpy shapes now growing along leading edges and navigation lights. They joked darkly about making a stalactite from the ice on the windshield and taking chunks of ice as souvenirs for colleagues who flew overweight. At the same time, they both knew the airplane was becoming heavily contaminated, including on the belly and around the intakes. At 14,000 feet, the Saab leveled off in the worst part of the cloud. The crew hoped to maintain it this way until they reached the edge of the weather shown on their radar. They kept the de-icing systems running and watched the wings, calling out patches that broke off and new ice that formed. They did not clearly link what they saw outside with what was happening on the instruments. Within about half a minute of leveling off, the indicated airspeed dropped from above 170 knots to around 145. The captain noticed and made a crude joke about the speed dropping, but there was no immediate change in power setting, no call to increase speed to the published minimum for icing. With heavy ice on the wings and speed below the recommended minimum, the airplane approached a stall. The first sign was buffet, a strong vibration as airflow began to separate from the upper wing surfaces. Instead of recognizing this as stall buffet, the captain assumed that ice had accumulated on the propeller blades, a problem he had faced before. Believing the vibration came from the props, he told the first officer to select maximum propeller revolutions to throw the ice off. The first officer complied. The vibration did not go away, because its source was the wings, not the propellers. Seconds later, the stick shaker activated, warning of an imminent stall. The speed slid further, to around 130 knots. Then lift broke down almost completely. The Saab pitched nose down and rolled sharply left, reaching a very high bank angle. The autopilot disconnected. Bank angle, alerts sounded. The cockpit voice recording captured brief, intense exchanges as both pilots tried to understand what was happening. They pulled back, advanced power, and fought the controls. But with the wings deeply stalled and the aircraft rolling in both directions, their actions did not match a standard stall recovery. The airplane entered a tumbling, inverted descent toward the desert. About 44 seconds after the first signs of stall buffet, Flight 5428 hit the ground nose first in the Patagonian steppe, between the small settlements of Los Manucos and Prahuaniu. The impact carved a crater and scattered burning debris over hundreds of meters. All 22 occupants died instantly. Local residents saw an aircraft flying unusually low, then heard explosions and saw smoke on the horizon. Rescue teams reached a scene with almost nothing recognizable left of the Saab. The investigation by Argentina's Civil Aviation Accident Board confirmed that there were no critical mechanical failures. Severe icing, beyond the conditions used for certification, had degraded the wing's performance. At the same time, the crew had not followed key procedures for icing operations. They allowed speed to remain well below the recommended minimum, and kept the autopilot in vertical speed mode instead of speed mode, letting the pitch increase and the airspeed fall. Stall recognition and recovery techniques were also inadequate. Investigators found that weather information given to the crew was incomplete and out of date, that the dispatcher did not provide available satellite data, and that his own training and certification were deficient. Safety recommendations called for better pilot training in icing, upset recovery, and stall recognition, stricter use of minimum icing speeds and autopilot modes, and improved distribution of weather information in remote regions. For crews, Flight of 5428 is now a case study in how heavy icing and cockpit workload can narrow attention, leading pilots to fixate on ice they can see while missing critical numbers on the instruments. For passengers, the accident is a reminder that in certain environments, ice is not just a physical hazard on the wings, but a factor that can quickly turn a normal flight into a high-stress situation on the flight deck if procedures and training are not strong enough to keep it under control. Even in the age of modern jets, satellite weather, and advanced automation, ice remains one of aviation's quietest and most persistent threats. It does not always announce itself with thick snow or heavy frost. Sometimes it hides where no one can see it. Inside a fuel line, on a sensor the size of a coin, along a wing's leading edge, or beneath the surface of a control hinge. A thin ridge of ice can change the shape of a wing. A small blockage can silence a pitot tube. A handful of crystals can choke an engine at the worst possible moment. From turboprops to wide-body jets, the pattern is the same. When the margins are thin, ice steals lift, steals power, and steals time. Yet every case in this documentary also shows the other side of the story. Training improves, procedures change, aircraft designs evolve, and pilots learn from the accidents that came before them. The industry never treats ice as solved, only as understood a little better than yesterday. In the end, ice is not dramatic or loud. It is simply the one enemy of aerodynamics that never stops trying to return. And that is why modern aviation never stops preparing for it. If you found this documentary valuable, please subscribe and like the video. It helps us reach more people, and it supports the work behind every story we tell.